Introducing the pinnacle of resilience and strategic prowess, the Elder Scrolls Online Trials main tank build. This build is meticulously crafted to excel in the challenging trials, where unwavering defense and precise coordination are paramount. As a main tank, your role is to bear the brunt of the enemy's assault, soaking up their devastating blows while leading your team to victory. The Trials main tank build boasts exceptional durability, utilizing a combination of robust armor, powerful defensive abilities, and impeccable resource management. Master the art of taunting and crowd control, commanding the attention of even the most fearsome adversaries. With unwavering focus, you'll protect your allies, mitigate damage, and create the ideal conditions for your team's success. Prepare to embrace the challenges that lie ahead as you step into the role of the Trials main tank. With this build, you'll become an unyielding bulwark, a guardian of your group, and an indispensable cornerstone of triumph. Are you ready to take the lead and conquer the trials that await? If you've delved into the Elder Scrolls Online recently, you're likely aware of the ever-evolving nature of the game. Consequently, setting up as a Trials tank can be a daunting task, as every group holds varying preference regarding sets, skills, and classes. Fear not, for this build is here to guide you through the process. In this comprehensive guide, we'll explore a general tank setup that will equip you with the necessary tools to meet the expectations of different groups. We'll discuss various options you may encounter and provide skill suggestions tailored to each class for Trials main tanking. For trial guides and to learn more about specific skills that you may require for different trial content, make sure you check out the trial guides at the Tank Club website. So the first thing we're going to look at is the race. Now, you would go with a Nord generally for Trials tanking, because for the long-term progression, you need to be a Nord tank ideally. For the newer trials that have come out in more recent times, you'll receive a lot of damage over time and bleed damage. The only way to manage this is to make sure you're at the resistance cap, and you do that by being a Nord. It will make it very easy to reach the resistance cap without focusing too much attention into buffing your resistances. And what that means then is that you'll be able to have better sustain, because you're putting less focus into buffing those resistances. You can gain sustain from other methods. The Nord will give you 3,600 physical and spell resistance, along with other benefits to max stamina, ultimate gain, max health, and frost resistance, as well as increasing the duration of any consumed drink by 15 minutes. For Trials tanking, your Munda Stone should be the Atronach generally. This provides magic recovery, and that is very, very valuable for all tank content. If you're doing something like Cloud Rest, you could also use the Steed, which will increase your health recovery and your movement speed. Both are very important in Cloud Rest because health recovery doesn't get diminished when you're debuffed. And obviously the movement speed is really useful because you do have to do a lot of moving around the room and kiting the darkness AoE, so that can be really useful. Aside from that, you've also got the Lady, which can be used to buff resistances if you've decided not to go with a Nord. For your food, there's three main options really that you can use for trial main tanking. If you are using Harmony Jewelry, then you might want to consider using Bewitched Sugar Skulls. And this is to increase your max stat, so that the gains that you have from using Harmony Jewelry aren't wasted. If you are playing on something like a Dragon Knight tank, where you're trying to maintain a stamina skill, something that you have to cast very frequently like Stone Giant, then Ozaga's Smoke Bear is very useful because it's going to give you all three recoveries as well as increased max health. For trials where you don't have to block a lot, such as Cloud Rest and Asylum Sanctorium, again, this would be the best food because you're not having to block very much, so you want to get the benefit of all those recoveries. Aside from that, you would go for something like Ozaga's Red Frothgar, which is going to give you huge Magicka recovery benefits, and obviously, as we've mentioned already, having really high Magicka recovery is very, very useful. There's generally two main potions to use for a trial main tank. That would be Essence of Health, the Tri-Stat potions to give you all of your resources and all of your recoveries, or Essence of Magicka, which is minor heroism potions. This is also going to buff your Magicka recovery and your stamina recovery and give you stamina Magicka back, and you're going to get that ultimate gain. There are some niche potions as well for things like Cloud Rest, where you get lingering health or increased movement speed, or things like immovable potions. They're very, very niche to specific situations, but those are things you can look at. Make sure you check out the Tank Club website to see more specific information about those. As a main tank, you'll be the person in charge of almost every single fight in every trial. You'll receive the main brunt of all the damage, so you'll want to stack up your resistances as close to the cap as you can. So the resistance cap is 33,000. Now, if you've got major and minor resolve, you've got your passives, and you've got your champion points. If you are a Nord as well, that's going to put you at the resistance cap. If you're not, then you're going to want to use some reinforced gear, some defending one-hander maybe as well, to try and get yourself closer to that cap, because the newer trials, your Rock Groves, your Dreadsail Reef, a lot of those things, Sanity's Edge, there is bleed effects, there's damage over time. Those are things that can't be mitigated by blocking and things like that, so you need to stack up resistances to deal with those effects, and those are very prominent in the newer trials, and one of the main reasons why you nowadays need to really stack up your resistances, which wasn't the case in the past. But those are some of the main portions of damage that you're going to struggle to deal with in the newer trials. So resistances are very integral for this level of gameplay. When it comes to magicka recovery, you will need approximately 2,000 to 3,000 magicka recovery as a minimum as a main tank to be able to sustain a 100% uptime of all your skills, your buffs and your debuffs. Having more will mean that you can utilise some skills more frequently, such as multiple casting Igneous Shield for the sustain and the shield, for example. So 2,000 would be the minimum, but anything higher that you can get with that will be more beneficial with those spammable skills that are going to give those additional benefits. And then in terms of your stats and attributes, as you can see here, you kind of need to customize your attributes based around whatever food you're using and based around whatever class, whatever race, whatever situation you're in. So for Trials main tanking, you want to aim for 40k max health as a kind of general number to aim for. And this is going to be for most trials, because you're going to be taking so much damage. You do want a really high max health pool. Now, you have to be very careful how you manage this, because max magicka and stamina come down to preference. You could opt for more health than 40k if you wanted to. It means then you can spend less time blocking. It gives you that bit more safety without needing to block as much, because you've got more health. So you can take more damage without dying. It's likely as a main tank you'll spend portions of time holding block though. So no stamina recovery will be active when you're blocking. That then means that you can't afford to have too low of a stamina bar, because then if your max stamina is too low, you're going to run up very quickly. So you need to account for the fact that as a trial main tank, there are going to be portions of fights where you are going to have to block for prolonged periods of time, 10 seconds, 15 seconds in some of the harder trials. There's other trials like Asylum Sanctorium where you don't need to block at all, other than for 1 second when he does the light attack, and then you drop your block. So every situation has a huge variation in how much you need to block, and you do need to make sure you've got enough stamina to be able to block for those phases. And this is again where your jewelry and food come into play. If you are using Harmony jewelry and you're using Bewitched Sugar Skulls in that case, then you've got much more higher max magicka and stamina, so then you can afford to put more points into health. If you're using something like Red Frothgar, you've got max health only on that food, but then you would need to try and manage your magicka and stamina some other way, because you're not going to get anything from the food. You are going to have lower magicka recovery, however, so it's all a balancing act. Generally, I think it's good to aim for a minimum of 20k stamina, but you can get anywhere up to 30k quite comfortably and quite easily, just depending on how you've distributed your points. And then with your magicka as well, magicka is like the least important stat, because your magicka recovery is always active. Every 2 seconds, you get a tick of magicka recovery, so you're going to be able to regain that nice and easily. However, you don't want to run out after casting 2 skills, so it's good to have somewhere between 15 and 18k, but again, you can get higher than that, as you can see right now. This is my character fully buffed, and I've got some really high stats, and this is because I don't have to use Red Frothgar, I don't have to use Sustain Food, because I'm in a trial situation where I'm going to be having access to a lot of synergies, so I'm using Harmony. If that wasn't the situation, and I'd be using Infused Jewelry, then I'd have to switch my food to something else as well. So that's what you got. That's the way you got to look at it. You got to try and play around with it to find the best solution for you. So when we're looking at main tank gear sets, it's a very difficult thing to try and plan, because every group is going to ask for different things. I'm going to go over a couple of different gear sets and tell you when and why to use them, and then you're going to have to just kind of figure that out within the group that you're going into. So the first gear set is Claw of Yolnahkrin. If your group is not using Oaken Soul Rings and also not using an Arcanist with Arcanist Domain, you'll need to use the Claw of Yolnahkrin set. It's a very useful set for those situations, because it's going to provide Minor Courage, which is a really nice weapon and spell damage buff for your group, and it's really easy to activate. But the problem is now, if you've got an Arcanist who's using Arcanist Domain, even an Arcanist tank, That has got a potential 30-second duration depending on which morph you've taken. Very easy to maintain it with just one skill. So Yolnahkrin is not as useful anymore, but it might still be used in some trial situations where you cannot get that Arcanist domain buff onto your group. Another set is Crimson Oath's Rive. With the current meta, many damage dealers will be using medium armor, meaning they'll be under the pen cap, and you can use Crimson on the main tank or the off tank in a trial situation to provide that buff. Now, a lot of groups will use somebody in a group with the Wrought of Alkosh set, usually on a damage dealer, in which case Crimson Oath is not useful. If you've got an Arcanist main tank using Runic Sunder and Tremor Scale, you don't need Crimson Oath either. So there's like a lot of situations again where Crimson Oath isn't a viable set because it's going to take you so far over the pen cap it's not actually useful anymore. So you have to think about that. Sorcerers also have a pen skill which might be being used but not very often. The next set we've got is Turning Tide. This is another very good set. It replaces the need for Necromancers using the Colossus Ultimate, but a lot of groups have a lot of Necromancer damage dealers who are using the Colossus Ultimate, and you also commonly see Necromancer off tanks, sometimes Necromancer healers, and they're also using Colossus Ultimates. In that case, Turning Tide obviously isn't very useful, but it is super easy to maintain a 100% uptime of major vulnerability if you've got a tank using Turning Tide from the main tank perspective, and then that's going to really help your group to maintain good damage. So there are some situations where Turning Tide might be the preferred option. If you're in a group with no Necros or a lack of Necros, Turning Tide is going to be very good. And then if you can tie this in with using Nazarite or Archdruid, you're going to get really super high uptimes very, very easily. And now we're on to kind of the more tanky sets that are going to be seen a lot more frequently now with the changes to the game and the way that the Arcanist works and all that kind of stuff. So you've got Pearlescent Ward, and if your group is using Alkosh or Tremor Scale, maybe you've got Necromancers using Colossus, things like that, Pearlescent Ward now is a very good set. Now this obviously doesn't stack, so you only need it on one tank. It's a heavy armor set. It's going to provide a damage buff, so it's an additional damage buff. If you're providing major courage, minor courage, you're already getting PA in your group from your off tank. What else can you wear? Well, Pearlescent Ward is a gear set now you can slot in there, and it's very, very good. Whether you're dead or alive, you're going to provide the buff. It's a damage buff when people are alive, and it's a great set because when people die, it gives a damage reduction buff as well, which means it's great for progression. So this is now becoming one of the really, really top sets for tanking just because of how it's very useful in a lot of different situations now, because we've got gear sets being replaced by skills and various other things. This is becoming a very much a staple gear set for tanking. Next we've got Saxhiel Champion. Now Sax Champion has always been kind of more of an off-tank set. It is a main tank set more now as well because you can combine it with a range of different ultimates. It doesn't matter what class you are, there's an ultimate you could use to benefit from using Sax Champion. So if you're an Arcanist, for example, Glyphic of the Tides could be used with Sax Champion to provide an additional damage buff and some safety with that group major protection. If you're on a Dragon Knight, you might use Sax Champion with Magma Shell to deal with some of the incredibly high damage that we're receiving in some of the newer trials, and it also gives a bit of a group shield as well. Obviously on a Necromancer, if you were a Necromancer tank, use it with the Colossus. If you were a Sorcerer main tank, you could combine it with the Storm Atronach. And obviously if your class doesn't have something, you could combine Sax Champion with Barrier. And what this does is it gives you the option of supplying an additional benefit to your group with that damage shield or with that other effect from those other ultimates, and then still giving the major force that you'd get from Warhorn. Now you do still need people in your group to be using Warhorn because you're going to be missing out on that 30% increased magicka and stamina. If you lose those, damage goes down a little bit. It's actually worth a couple of percent of DPS by having the actual horn providing those increased max stats. So if that drops off, then obviously that's a problem. But it is possible to use Sax now, even on the main and the off tank if that was the only sets that were going to be useful within your group, but generally you wouldn't do that. Another benefit to Sax Champion is the fact that if you can build up your ultimate fast, you can actually get a longer uptime on major force than you'd get from aggressive horn. So it is particularly useful as well in those trial situations where you've got a lower uptime on horn. So I'm thinking one of the main places is like Asylum Sanctorium, where you've got a healer at the far end of the room, a healer at the other far end of the room, then you're off tank in the middle near the group, and everyone's so spread out it can be sometimes really, really tricky to get that major force buff on your group, and the uptime is very low. By having Sax Champion, you can increase the duration by, when you use your ultimate, you consume more ultimate to give a longer duration, and that can be super helpful as well. And then the last couple of sets are more niche sets. So Powerful Assault is a potential main tank set in some situations. It's not always used for the main tank, it's very rarely used for a main tank, but things like stack and burn fights in, I don't know, a Therian Archive, where everyone's close together, it's a stack and burn fight, you could use PA. Cloud Rest, it's a stack and burn fight, you can use PA there, and it's also good because it's useful in the main room, it's useful in the portal, so it's a good main tank set in those specific stack and burn fights. Another set, very niche, again, is Elemental Catalyst. It's not as good on some classes compared to others, but it is often used in Asylum Sanctorium, so it's something that you might want to have if you intend on progressing Asylum Sanctorium and the hard modes, and maybe the trifectas later down the line. It's a good set to pick up. And then aside from that, there's not a huge amount of 5-piece sets that are worth using. In terms of monster sets, there's only really 3 main options for your main tank. You've got Tremor Scale if your group need an armor pen. If they need additional pen, you use Tremor Scale. And that scales off your resistances. So the more resistances you've got, the better this is. So if you are a little bit over the resistance cap as well, there's actually like a little benefit to that in terms of the buff that you're providing with Tremor Scale. Another gear set would be Nazare. So you try and make sure that you've got loads of effects active on the enemy, loads of debuffs active on the enemy, then you use your ultimate, and it extends those durations for a really long time. And it means that things that require ultimate usage or things that have really short durations can be maintained much easier because you proc that Nazarite and it extends those durations, and it means that your group could increase their DPS by quite a lot. And then the last one really for the main tank would be Archdruid. So when you do a heavy attack, it procs the gear set, it applies major vulnerability, and that means that you don't need to use as many Colossus potentially because you've got that buff there with just a heavy attack. So those are the 3 kind of main monster sets. When you are using gear sets like Sax Champion, for example, you can just 1-bar that gear set. You use it on the back bar, you just use your back bar ultimate, and then you can use a weapon set such as Puncturing Remedy, and that's really good for the main tank. If you can squeeze this in, so it's really good for that additional burst heal, buff up your resistances. The resistances aren't exactly reliable because they're on a short duration, but it's something that's going to give you some extra strength. It's also possible to use a double Frost Staff main tank build. Now this isn't super common, but you will see it in fights such as Dreadsail Reef, where it's important to maintain Frost Clench on a boss to maintain that major and minor main, because it's going to reduce the damage by quite a lot. And by switching bar, if you've set it up in a decent way, you're not going to have much damage difference between the two. But by being able to apply really high uptimes on Major Breach, it's also giving really high uptime on Minor Brittle. It means your group's going to do more damage, the boss is doing less damage, and especially in fights where everyone's getting hit, such as Dreadsail Reef, it's really good to be able to have that option there, where you are applying that Frost Clench every 4 seconds just to maintain that debuff. When you do set up with a double Frost Staff build, it does mean you've got additional gear options, because then you wouldn't be using obviously the Puncturing Remedy set. It does mean that you can use your 2 5-piece sets can be used on the staff, one on one bar and then one on the other, and then it does open up the opportunity to kind of bring in a mythic item. So in that case, you could kind of use Bloodlord's Embrace, you could use any mythic really that you like within a Frost Staff build to make it work. So you keep your monster set, you keep your 2 5-piece sets, but you lose any potential weapon set and then bring in a mythic item along with potentially a 1 piece of armor of the trainee for that additional buff. So in terms of the gear, obviously Master's One Hand and Shield we've got here, we've got the Sax Ice Staff, we've got Tremor Scale on the head and the shoulder, Turning Tide, and then yeah, the Sax Champion Jewelry. And that's a good main tank setup. Like I've said before, you could switch around. You might need to use Pearlescent Ward on the body, Crimson Oath, things like that. So there's a lot of different things to customize here. In terms of the traits and enchants, for the gear you really want to make sure that you've got Reinforced if you're not at the resistance cap, otherwise go with Divines. And that's going to increase your recovery, and it means it's going to make things really easy in terms of sustaining. It's good to use a 5-on-1 set to get the additional perks and the different passives, so medium armor passives, light armor passives, and the heavy armor passives, as well as increased max stats from the Undaunted. It's really good to have a 5-on-1 setup. But you can kind of switch this around. You are going to get different levels of mitigation from different things, because you've got your heavy armor bonuses and your light armor bonuses and things like that you've got to take into consideration as well. But it's all like very minimal gains, small percentage gains here and there. So 5-on-1 is just a general good setup to go with. On your one-hander, it's very customizable. There's so much access to minor vulnerability that a charge shot glyph on your one-hander isn't essential for a trial content. This means that you can use things like Absorb Stamina, you can use things Absorb Magicka, you could use Hardening if you want a little shield, You can use infused, you can use decisive for more ultimate gain, you could use defending if you're way under the resistance cap as well. So there's a lot of different things you can use there. On your ice staff, you've always got to use infused crusher. There's no real other option. You have to use that because that is going to be needed by multiple people to apply it to the boss with a maximum uptime. And then for your jewelry, Harmony Magica Recovery is the top one to use. In trials like Sunspire, where maybe your group don't think too much about where they're sending their synergies, it might be a good idea to switch to infused, because you just might not be getting enough synergies, and then it's like becoming a problem that this is a wasted trait if you're not using any synergies. So you can switch over to infused for those trials where your group are not facing you and you're not getting enough synergies. It's a good idea to have the option to switch it over. But generally, in trial situations, you're going to have so many incoming resources from synergies, and then combining that with Harmony just makes the most sense. The Magica Recovery, again, is the best option because it performs the best out of all of the enchants. The only time that's not the case is if you are using a Dragon Knight and they're maybe using Stone Giant, or you're using any class that's got a stamina skill that they have to cast frequently. Then the Tri Recovery becomes better, where you get all 3 recoveries. That works better in a situation where you've got stamina skills. But for most classes, they just don't have more than 1 stamina skill. The Pierce Armor is most of the time the only stamina skill you might use on a trial main tank. So you need Magica Recovery more than anything else. Magica Cost Reduction generally doesn't work that well. It can work well if you are casting a skill every single second and you've got enough recovery to back it up. So you need to have 2 to 2.5k Magica Recovery. Then you could use Magica Cost Reduction on your jewelry, but only if you can get to 2k to 2.5k recovery as well. Use the Magica Cost Reduction, that will reduce the cost of your Magica skills. When it comes to the skills that are being used, I've put some skill bars on the screen there for every class. It's always going to be different depending on the gear that you're wearing. As you can see here, I'm using Sax Champion on this build as I showed you, so I've not got the Warhorn Ultimate on the build. Obviously you'd put Warhorn on if you're not using Sax. It's very difficult to plan a standard skill bar for all trials, but the main focus here is having a heal, having all your buffs, and then group benefits. That is what you should be focusing on the most. Now there's some group benefits that aren't really useful to provide, such as Crystal Weapon on a Sorcerer main tank would be extremely difficult because it's got such a short uptime, and you have to cast the skill and then a light attack to proc it. It doesn't really work well in that situation, so it would be incredibly hard to maintain it. But the focus is on survival, sustaining, and then group buffing, and that can be seen here with these skill bars. Now, no matter what class you're playing, I'm going to show you a few kind of optional skills and passives that you can use. So obviously when you've got your class skills and passives, you always just take all of your class passives, unless there's some that are genuinely not going to be useful. So damage based things are not essential. You'd only take those if you absolutely wanted to and you've got the additional skill points. You obviously buy these out to do a bit more damage, but you focus on getting your class passives first. In terms of everything else, on your weapon, on your one-hander, you take all of your passives there. And then when you look at your different skills, Heroic Slash is a flex skill that you can bring in for situations where you want to gain more ultimate, if you can slot that in. You've got Shield Charge that you might need for certain trials where you've got to gap close. Things like VHOF, where you've got to try and gap close to the enemy, or sometimes on mechanics where you've got to switch bosses. Dreadsail Reef first boss, the triplets in VHOF again. You might want to use Shield Charge to do that quicker, so that's an option that you've got there. For your Destruction Staff, all of your skills here have got some kind of use. Crushing Shock is obviously needed for some trials where you've got ranged interrupts. Elemental Drain and Elemental Susceptibility can be used. Things like Cloud Rest Portals, where you've got no group members down there, you've just got you and a damage dealer or 2 damage dealers. You want to obviously provide some benefits to the group there. You can apply that onto the crystals to help to kill those. Pulsar is a really good skill for ad pulls in trial content. You run through and you spam this to give your group additional minor protection, and if there's any smaller enemies, they'll get minor manga, but the elite enemies, generally trial ads won't be able to be mangled, but you will be able to give them minor brittle and minor maim as well. For your passives here, you want to take the bottom 3, like those are the most essential. Trifocus is not something that I like to use, and then Penetrating Magic is only needed if you want to increase your damage. Armor passives, obviously you've got the main 3 there, the top 3, and then the bottom 2 are not really that useful. This is why you use the 5-1-1 setup, so that you get the additional snare reduction, sprint cost reduction, you get increased Magica Recovery and Magica Cost Reduction, and then you also get increased spell resistance. And it's quite a big chunk of spell resistance there as well. On the medium armor, Dexterity isn't absolutely essential, but you'll get a little bit of increased healing done Windwalker is essential for stamina recovery and stamina cost reduction, and then athletics, which is going to give you a movement speed bonus and reduce the cost of your dodge roll. Obviously for heavy armor, you're using 5 pieces of heavy, so you always want to take all of your heavy armor passives. For your guild passives, if you've got Silver Leash, because you'll need that for most classes apart from the DK and the Warden, then you'll take Intimidate Presence to reduce the cost of that. Some classes will use Balance. You don't really need it on an Arcanist, but you might need it on other classes to sustain, so then you would take the 3 middle passives here. Most classes will need Race Against Time for a movement speed buff, especially for trial content, because you've got to stay ahead of your group. Sometimes you've got to do quite a bit of running, so you'll need that, and then you might as well take the passives that go alongside that if you can. For your Undaunted, the skills here aren't as useful as they used to be. Overflowing Ult can still be useful sometimes. Trapping Webs, the synergy that gets, can be useful again. And then your 2 passives there are very, very useful. Obviously, when you're using Harmony Jewelry, combined with the Undaunted command, that becomes a very strong option. And then Undaunted Metal, we're getting a 6% bonus to our max stats thanks to using a 5-1-1 setup. In our Alliance skills, obviously having the option of Warhorn in case you don't use sacks is essential. Having options of charge and maneuver just in case you're providing a speed boost to your group for certain trial content, that will be needed. Razor Caltrops can be a good skill as well for when you need to do AoE Major Breach in trials, and that's often quite a common thing you might need to do. In your support skill line, obviously having Barrier and your Magicka Raid passive is really good for increased Magicka recovery. You will need to take Efficient Purge here as well, so it's really important to level up your support skill line. Efficient Purge is needed in quite a few different trials to remove negative effects. And then also you've got the option of, if you are a newer tank, slotting Revealing Flare for that passive Major Protection. Something like this is better to use Major Protection, slot this on your bar, and get the benefits of that, rather than switching your gear to a more selfish gear setup. You can do things like Revealing Flare, change some champion points around, and play a more defensive setup with your skills that's going to have less of a negative impact on your group than dropping some of your stronger gear sets. Always take all of your racial passives, and then in your crafts it's really essential as well to have medicinal use to increase the duration of your potions so that you can have a 100% uptime. So if you do use a potion on cooldown, you're just going to get a permanent benefit to whatever it is you've got on there. So maybe it's your recoveries, permanent benefits to your recovery. And then with your provisioning passes as well, you can also take these to increase the duration of your food and drinks. For trial tanking, there is a few different options for your champion points. Obviously the general ones are Ironclad, Duelist Rebuff, Enduring Resolve and Bulwark. Unassailable is also one that you need to have available for things like Sunspire where you're in the Dragon Breath. This is going to be useful in that situation. And then you've got some other niche ones where maybe you're at the resistance cap, you don't need the AoE reduction, so you want to take increased healing passives instead, where you might need to heal yourself or where you're away from your group. So something that springs to mind there might be in Cloud Rest. You might decide to take something like that to buff yourself up. In the blue CP, it's also really important to make sure you've got Flawless Ritual if you're using various skills like Pulsar. So for ad pulls and using Pulsar, you want to have Flawless Ritual to increase the rate that you're applying Minor Breach and Minor Brittle to the enemy. And then your red CP is the very customizable one because again you've got some standard ones here. Ballast Vitality, Fortified and Rejuvenation are kind of 3 standard champion point passives you can take because they're going to give you permanent benefits to your character. And you've got very niche champion points that you can take, such as Slippery. This can be good if you are a brand new player in Cloud Rest, because sometimes when you're in those +1, 2 and 3 and you've got the enemy doing various attacks that you can't see, so you might have one of the mini bosses that's doing its attack and then you kind of get hit by that because it goes through the boss, you don't see it, you get stunned and then you get killed, whereas this is going to automatically break you free, so that can be useful. Another one might be Expert Evasion, so in a trial where you've got to dodge a lot, maybe it's going to proc on cooldown, so if you are going to be dodging attacks, Asylum Sanctorium, you can dodge all the heavy attacks. There's various places where you can dodge all attacks from bosses, at which point Expert Evasion might become useful. You want to take pretty much everything that doesn't need slotting. Things like Tumbling are obviously very useful. Defiance, increased sprint speed, all incredibly useful. Even things like Piercing Gaze increases your stealth detection. Sometimes you might skip certain ad pulls, so you'll want to have this as a tank because your detection radius is bigger because you are a tank. Definitely for progressive trials, Tempered Soul is very important. Return to life after resurrection with 10% more resources. This is like an essential one for progressive trials. You don't want somebody to res you and then you've got no resources, then you can't start tanking again straight away. The wait until you've got your resources back, that can take time, by which point it might be too late. Other really useful things, obviously hasty and celerity is very useful for trials during the ad pull phases and certain places like Cloud Rest. Obviously Cloud Rest requires a lot of movement. Really big trials like VHOF, you want to be running ahead. You've got phases where you run ahead of the other tank and things like that. So celerity is really important for trial content. Obviously increasing your block mitigation with fortification, tireless guardian, even things like savage defense, reduce the cost of bash, will help sustain that little bit. Nimble protector to increase your movement speed more. Bracing is useful. And then you've got an option here. Bracing anchor is good for increasing block mitigation, but then you've also got the option of ward master, which is 10% reduction, which is super useful because this will only be this is only block mitigation, so that's only going to affect things that are single target hits generally, whereas reducing the damage taken while blocking, this isn't just direct damage, this is just damage reduction in general. So this is really useful if you're on a class that has a damage shield, Arcanist, Sorcerer, Templar, DK, that is going to be really good to have as well. Other niche things that you could slot: Shield Master, reduce the cost of your damage shield abilities by 2%. Things like Bastion, both really good on an Arcanist, can be good on things like a DK. Not always going to be useful, but things where you need really big damage shields or really you need to cast damage shields frequently, then obviously that's going to be good. And then things like Strategic Reserve might be good for a place like the Cloud Rest portals, so you try and use your ultimate before you go in the portal. While you're in the portal you don't use it, so the longer you stack it up, the more health recovery you get. It helps you get through some of those more difficult phases where you're out of group or away from group. So that is everything for our Trials main tank build for Necrom. As I said before, make sure you check out the Tank Club website on our trial guide page if you want to know more about how to do certain trials from the tank perspective. Look at what skills you might need to slot specifically. Maybe it's like a ranged interrupt, maybe it's a chain or something like that. We'll have all that information over on the website, so go and check that out. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye for now.